Yeah, hello, all bright minds out there. It's great to see you all here online to our Alum Chat. We hold this coffee break to meet and discuss with our alums, and it's today a pleasure and honor to host this event together with the Boat Steamer Institute for Austrian American Studies. And I have with me today Kevin McNamara, and I would like to hand now the virtual microphone to you, Kevin.
Well, thanks, Hermann. I just wanted to say that I'm delighted to be here. We're delighted to support Fulbright Austria, and of course, delighted to associate ourselves with the really fascinating work that the scholars do, that you and I both support. I love this part of it too. I learned so much, and I'm so honored to be on the same virtual dais as them. So with that, I'm just eager to hear what they have to say.
Thank you, Kevin. And it's also a pleasure to have you here and an honor. It's a pleasure and honor to have two alums from Fulbright Austria and Boat Steamer here as well. So today we have with us Hannelore Veit. She is a journalist and moderator and author. She is well known to everybody here in Austria. Until January 2021, she served as the North American correspondent and the bureau of chief for ORF, the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation. So with this, it's an honor to have you here, Hannelore. Before you joined the ORF, you worked as a Swiss-based European business channel.
Yes,
as a correspondent to Tokyo. So speaking about international relations, you embody them. And before that, even as a radio correspondent for Voice of America's East Europe Bureau. So that's amazing. And it's also amazing that you are a Fulbright Austria alum as a student. So you studied in Notre Dame at the university in Indiana in 1981, I remember.
Yeah.
So how was that time?
I loved it. It was the best experience ever. I mean, it was, the Midwest. It was cornfields. It's South Bend, Indiana. Notre Dame is in the middle of cornfields, basically. But Chicago was close. So that is a city I love, with everything you want. Except good weather, but well, you can't have everything. But I really loved it. It just opened my mind to a different culture, which in the end was not so different when I think of Japan, which was a really, really different culture. And ever since, I've considered myself a part of me has stayed in the US. And that's why I absolutely wanted to come back as a correspondent for ORF, for the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation. I stayed there for 8 years, for the past 8 years.
Thank you. And we have with us here also Gregory Perreault from the United States, a US scholar who was to Austria in 2021 as the Fulbright Boat Steamer visiting professor of Austrian American Studies in Austria. Greg is an associate professor of multimedia journalism at the Appalachian State University and was here, as I mentioned, in the middle of COVID-19. So he had a very special experience here in Austria. His recent work experiences is more about news coverage of hate, lifestyle journalism, and gamification. So you cover a broad area of fields in your specialty, and you won a lot of awards. So congratulations for that. And you got the honor and of being a Fulbright scholar here in Austria. So with this, we always start our discussion with the revealing of a secret. It's a coffee break. So what's your favorite coffee?
Well, I'm almost ashamed to say it's American coffee. The bigger, the better. An Americano was what I used to get. And I've been back here for a year. So I'm slowly getting back into the Austrian mode. And I'm now at the stage of verlängerter Schwarze. But my favorite is still an American coffee in the morning.
And it's funny that Hannelore says that. I actually became a convert during my time in Vienna and fell in love with the grosser espresso. When I first got there, I was sort of surprised. I wanted to get just a normal drip coffee, and so I asked for coffee, and well, what kind of coffee? But the espresso ended up really coming to life for me. So I make my own now. I'm very specific about the type of espresso I like.
So with this, let's talk about journalism.
So Hannelore, the pandemic, of course, impacted a ton of fields, impacted my Fulbright experiences, impacted journalism all across the globe. I'd love to hear from your experience, how did the pandemic affect you as a professional in this field?
It was terrible. It happened during election year, which is, of course, the busiest year you can imagine for a journalist in Washington, D.C. And it was a very, very important election coming up. Trump, another 4 years of Trump or not. And we had plans traveling throughout the country, reporting on different subjects, on political news, also on what else was happening in the country, different issues, and all that, of course, stopped with the pandemic. Background stories are something that only correspondents can actually really supply, because, you know, every news organizations, you sit in the office, you sit at the headquarters, you have all kinds of videos coming in, and you build your own story around these videos. But to go out and do background reporting, I consider that the core business of correspondence, and we couldn't do much. Really, we couldn't do much. And of course, it was so hectic. Things were happening in Washington anyway. Everything coincided: the pandemic, the lockdown, protests that started over the killing of George Floyd. The city, Washington, was a fortress. There were fortresses within each other. The fortress at the center was the White House. Wires, barbed wires, fences around the White House, because the president Trump at the time, of course, wanted to fence himself in. He had nothing to do with the rest of the city, which of course is a very democratic city. And the mayor of Washington did everything she could to annoy the president, who of course resides in the center of the city. The city center of Washington was boarded up. We had protests that spring. It was unbelievable what was happening. So everything was sort of thrown into nothing went according to the way we had planned. And we had the election coming up. For every election, a major news organization, I mean, we have a small office of 9-10 people. We cover ORF, I mean the Austrian Broadcasting Organization, but we cover all of the United States from that office. So we had plans for covering the elections with people coming in from the headquarters to help us, to support us. We didn't even know if we would have people coming, because you couldn't travel at the time. It was we had so many special broadcasts planned, but we did what we could with our minimal staff. We were working really a lot at that time. It turned out in the end, we could have some people coming in from Austria. There were a few journalists very few who had American citizenship, so they could of course travel. And in the end, a few weeks before the election, other journalists were allowed in. So yes, it was a very difficult year. I'm sorry to say it was my last year in the States, and I had all these plans of traveling to the places where I hadn't been, reporting about issues there. And you know, my traveling was basically towards the end of the summer, a long trip to Maine to report on the Republican Party. But other than that, I didn't get out of the city. I didn't get out of Washington.
You alluded to so many huge changes that occurred during that time, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think are going to be the long-lasting sort of changes to the field?
definitely the way we started doing at that time interviews, because we just did our interviews by Zoom, by Skype. Before that, it was possible, but we wouldn't really use it because nobody would accept it for television. You know, a Skype interview really doesn't look good. By now, first of all, they look a lot better by now because that's 2 years after. But also it's just accepted practice and people have got used to it. Before that, I do remember we're doing TV and radio, and our radio studio, we had a special line where we could record interviews for radio so that the quality would be okay. It was all a special setup, and now you just do it with a phone, basically. We have learned how to use that. That, I believe, will stay. And I'm not sure I really, really like it all that much, but it's a helpful tool when you want to talk to somebody who is not in the city where you, or in the area where you live or where you work. Of course, a lot is lost because personal interviews, there's so much, there is the setting, there is the interaction, there is nonverbal communication. All that is, of course, lost with Zoom or with Skype. Well, Greg, let me ask you, how did it impact, how did COVID impact your Fulbright experience? How did it impact your research projects in Vienna?
Sure. So in quite a few ways, in the most important things, it didn't, I still managed to go to Austria and had a phenomenal experience. But I think as with many professions, there was this air of uncertainty. I remember going to the airport with my huge stack of documents, sort of wondering, will I be able to get on the plane? If I get off the plane, will I get to the next place? And even going up to the border control guards and sort of wondering, is this all going to be okay? And of course, it all was okay. But then for me, I was planning to bring my whole family. I've got a family of wife, 4 kids. Are we going to be able to get everyone over? What if, some can get through and some can't? What happens if someone tests positive the day before? So just an enormous amount of stress, waiting to see, are they going to be able to join as well? Again, all worked out fine. Some of the most substantial changes were obviously in trying to adjust the research project for the realities of COVID. And so, I think, first of all, that was reflected in the fact that I couldn't show up in person. I'd planned to do interviews on site with journalists, where I would follow them around, see how they were bringing new practices of digital technologies into the newsroom, how they were using those. And of course, that became entirely impossible with COVID protocols. So we had to do interviews as well, which ended up being quite fine. And we ended up getting some great data from it, but it wasn't what was intended. But one of the things we drew from it has actually ended up being sort of one of the trends in the field, which is looking at the labor of journalists. I think for so long, we've just sort of treated it, and Hannelore, I know you're from practice, so you've probably experienced this too. Like, we just treat it as matter of course, that journalists work hard at all hours, beyond the hours that they work, and never get to turn off. And I think one of the things COVID did such a, I always look for the silver linings of things. I think one of the things we could perhaps take as a silver lining is paying more attention to the labor that journalists undertake to do this really important normative tasks for our society, right? Which is they are faced with really hard topics, and in sort of not always given a ton of support for how to deal with those personally, professionally, and yet still have to go on with their jobs and still have to report the news. Anyone who's done the crime beat has had to see some very difficult things and yet still had to go on with their job. Of course, the work I do deals with hate and harassment. Journalists manage some serious hostility in many countries in the world, and expected to carry on with their work. And the topic that ended up being sort of the focus of what I did in Austria was, we also expect them to innovate. They're not given any training, but here's a bunch of new social media tools. So please take these, integrate these into your work, and do a great job with it. And I have to say that I think journalists do a great job integrating those things. But it does come at a I think a physical as well as a mental cost. And I think one of the things that's been great in scholarly conversation is much more awareness of what journalists undertake to do these important tasks for our world. I think it's my turn to ask you a question, Hannelore. So you've been interested in the United States, both personally and professionally for a long time. I think one of your first posts was for Voice of America in Vienna. What was it like to work in a transatlantic capacity as a journalist? What kind of impact has this had on your career?
Well, for me, I think it was the best thing that could have happened, because journalism, to start in journalism in an American news bureau for the Voice of America is to start, first of all, in a language that is a perfect language for journalism. Short sentences, clear sentences, very unlike German, where you go through a sentence and weave in throughout the sentences. You can't do that in journalism. That's not a language for journalism. And it was on-the-job training. I had studied translation interpretation in Vienna and American studies at Notre Dame. So I gradually moved into journalism because I knew I wanted to move away from what I had studied, which, by the way, is a very American thing, I understand, because not too many Americans stay in the field where they actually majored at college. So I had very good training on the job. And I also learned a lot in terms of how to deal with a world that is very different from the world that we in the United States and in Austria are used to, a world where we have freedom of speech, because I confess I'm so old that I traveled to Warsaw Pact countries, not to too many because traveling was very, very difficult, but to report on situations in Warsaw Pact countries, then you really know that we live in a world which should be a normal world, but which is actually a privileged world, because so many countries in this world do not have freedom of speech, freedom of expression, free elections. I make a point of going to every election, whether I know or not who I want to vote for, but just go there and do your duty as a citizen, because I have seen it doesn't work like that everywhere. And different experience, of course, was Japan. I lived for 4 years in Japan, not in the sense of I was limited in what I could report, but just adjusting to a different world, adjusting to a different way of thinking, a much more collective way of thinking, as opposed to individual way of thinking that we are used to, and doing things in a different way. As a journalist, small example, you want to interview somebody. Okay, in Japanese, I had my producer, so she always went with me also as a translator, because my Japanese is like scotchy. You interview somebody, they say, yeah, okay, let's meet for a cup of tea. So you travel through Tokyo for a cup of tea where you discuss nothing about what you really want to discuss, go back, and then maybe a week later, you actually go back for the interview. But relationships are very important. You have to build a relationship in order to even have access to your sources. So very, very interesting and very different experiences. In a way, Voice of America helped me also go to Japan, because when Voice of America, funded of course by the government, also requires that people have the journalists, if they want to move on, if they want to have a career at some point, they need to have the US citizenship, which of course I didn't. So I had reached the ceiling there, and then I decided with my husband, who had been offered a job to Japan, to go there, and Voice of America said, yeah, okay, do freelance work for us there. So for me, it was a great opportunity. Okay, I'm talking a lot, I realize, but let me ask you a question. Of course, I'm talking about a time when there was no such thing as digital journalism. It didn't exist. Now, of course, we all use it. You especially came to Austria, Greg, to study how journalists in Austria and in the United States practice digital journalism. What did you specifically examine? Did you find similarities? What were they?
Absolutely. One of the things that ended up being the focus for Volker Hanisch, who's a distinguished professor at University of Vienna, and I's project is the use of Instagram. So most of the social media research that's been done with journalists integrating social media into their practices and whatever has been with Twitter, which makes sense. Journalists really love Twitter. Facebook also has gotten a lot of attention, particularly for political journalism work. Instagram has received a lot less attention, which I find interesting in that in the past year, it's actually become the most proliferated platform. I think it's particularly prominent in the global South compared to these other platforms. It's easy to see why it would be preferable for certain forms of journalism, right? So if you're reporting on travel or food and wine or beauty, right? There's obvious value to being able to emphasize the imagery. And Instagram does such a great job of that. And so other platforms have, of course, brought in some of that, but Instagram, I think, really sort of created a corner on the market in that way of telling stories on social media. And so what was interesting in the interviews is that Austrian journalists, when they saw that they were sort of being paired with American journalists, had this interesting thing where they said, well, I'm sure we're not as digitally focused as our American counterparts. And that's not what we found at all. Austrian American journalists, we had initially thought that we would have to have them sort of in two different samples, not look at them as sort of using journalism in the same way or using Instagram in the same way. And they used digital technology in incredibly similar manners. And we're integrating, their new sort of practices for using Instagram in very similar manners. Where differences were in the beats that they were on. So if you're in food and wine, it would make sense that your use of Instagram would be really, really robust because you'd want to take pictures of this amazing food and this amazing wine and the location where you're having this amazing food and wine. Whereas if you're in, doing city council reporting or something, like, how would you use Instagram for, there's only so much interesting imagery you can get from a city council meeting, So we found that the niches that journalists were in played a really important role. But to be more specific, one of the things we found that was very interesting in how they applied their use of Instagram is that we think of journalists bringing in innovation in relation to pre-digital forms, right? Oh, they're bringing in this new technology. Let's compare it to before there was social media, which is an interesting way in scholarship that we do this because actually it's more like stacking. So one of the interesting things we found was that journalists mostly had their Instagram posts at 220 characters. 220 characters. Instagram allows 2,200 characters. So why 220? 220, or I think it's 280. 280 is the norm for Twitter, right? So the journalists who start out on Twitter are applying the same sort of structure for how they tell their written parts of their story when they bring it to Instagram, which we found to be an interesting way of thinking about journalists innovating in the field. To bring it back to you, Hannelore, I'd love to sort of ask a little bit about political journalism. So coverage of the Trump presidency and the 2020 election was intense globally. And you traveled across the US from New York to LA, reporting on US politics and gaining a sense of the mood of the country in your recent book, Voices from a Divided Land. So what's it like to cover US news as an Austrian journalist? And what was your sense of particularly interesting or newsworthy things that you found as from an Austrian perspective that might be different from how the US covered its own news?
Yeah, I'd just like to add a point to what you said before, political journalism and Instagram. Let me just one sentence here. There are some who do it very, very well. And I love how The Economist does that, how you have the news on Instagram with The Economist and the BBC. I really, really like them because you get so much in such a short time. Okay, so that was just an aside. You asked me about covering US news as an Austrian journalist. Yeah, you mentioned traveling. It's so important. And I mentioned that before, background stories is really one of the central tasks that we have as correspondents. What I found difficult during, I was there for 8 years, 4 years Obama, second term of Obama, and 4 years Trump presidency. What I found difficult, especially during the Trump presidency, was to explain to Europeans, to Austrians in my case, that how Americans could have voted for Trump, why was that possible? Because Austrians just still don't understand. So you really have to explain what is going on. You have to talk to people. I went to North Dakota to talk to Republicans there, and very, very, very nice people. And you know, in Europe, the idea was, Trump bad, you know, very, very simplistic. So my task was also to explain what was happening. And there's a lot of background that usually comes into it. You have to explain the different systems. Health insurance, health care was a big topic during the election. So it's very different from what we have here, from Sozialsystem, from, you know, Krankenversicherung on a totally different level. In America, they were talking about socialism in healthcare. Yeah, well, okay. Just explain basically the different ways of functioning in daily life and structures. Another thing was access as an Austrian journalist, because we are here, if I'm ORF, if I'm Austrian Broadcasting Corporation here in Vienna, I call somebody and I say, I want an interview, and I get it. If I'm Austrian Broadcasting Corporation in Washington, I call somebody, I want an interview, I don't get it. Basically, it's very, very difficult because you're a nobody, you're a very small European country. It helps to be from Germany or France. In that case, Austria, well, okay. You don't bring one single vote, and that's all that counts for politicians, basically. I tried really hard to get an interview with the president, who happened to be Trump, when our chancellor was visiting Washington and the White House, but even that was impossible. And I tried through all the channels possible, you know, the official channel, through the White House for press, for foreign press, through the Austrian delegation and the Austrian embassy, and through my personal contacts at the White House with other journalists, with people who work there. It didn't work, because you have to get used to being a nobody if you work for the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation in the United States. I think Hermann has mentioned it before, Greg. Some of your work was about hate groups. You found that journalists in the United States who report on hate groups regard the First Amendment of the Constitution as essential to their work. Can you talk about some of the findings? What are some of the ways how it affects journalists? And how does it, hate groups and the First Amendment, what did you find out there?
Sure. So this is a subject that's really important to me, in the sense that, unfortunately, to some degree, hate is something that is, these sort of populist-oriented hate groups are really taking hold in a lot of countries in the world. In the US, statistically, this appears to be the case. And so journalists often find themselves not necessarily always having the training necessarily to cover some very difficult situations. In one case, I interviewed a US-based journalist who, recent graduate from college program, sent to cover a neo-Nazi rally with no notice, just the day of, and told once she arrived, you know, you haven't done your Facebook Live hit today. You need to go live on Facebook. And of course, it ended up just providing a platform. In this case, it was for Billy Roper, who's a terrible human being. And she was ashamed, really ashamed. And so journalists, I think, oftentimes really struggle to know what's the best way to do this. You know, by interviewing these people, if I don't interview them, am I silencing a group, a side of the story? You know, if I talk to them, am I providing them a platform? And so journalists sometimes feel trapped. What's the appropriate way? And what complicates this is these are sometimes very unsafe situations. One journalist talked about interviewing the Ku Klux Klan, and he's told, blindfolded, put in the back of a car, taken, these are not safe situations. And journalists put themselves in these situations because what they're reporting on is important, right? And so in this particular top study that you're referring to, we asked journalists who had covered hate groups, rallies, things like that, how they think about the First Amendment. And what was interesting is that in many cases, they really didn't see how the First Amendment could help them. And in many cases, we actually thought it could provide sort of a well of information to help them understand how to provide context for the things that they were seeing. And that was one of the things that they often felt like they lacked, is a roadmap for the ways to effectively cover these groups without granting them legitimacy. So one of the ways that these hate groups operate is by building doubt in the media. And so, Hannelore, I'd love to sort of ask you a little bit about this. So fewer Americans than ever trust mainstream news. News has become very polarized. How do you navigate this polarization as a practicing journalist? What are some of your specific concerns about polarization?
Yeah, I just noticed during the Trump years that the media became more and more polarized. Basically, there was only pro-Trump and anti-Trump after 4 years, and organizations that had been much more to the center, like CNN, went anti-Trump, totally anti-Trump, and would only discuss what they didn't like in, endless roundtable discussions and whatnot. Trump, of course, he called the mainstream news fake news, was speaking of the failing New York Times all the times. And it is true, there are statistics. Pew think tank in Washington, very respectable, did a story on that. How do people trust the national news organizations, and what happened during the past few years? It's amazing if you look at them. Of course, the trust is declining, but there is a huge partisan divide. Republicans were, and I looked up the figures again, there were 70% who said they trusted the national news organizations in 2016. 6 months ago, it was 35%. It's unbelievable. But for us, of course, we as reporters, we have to see what's happening in the national media, in the news, in the country. So for me, a very good lesson was, which I did sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes in breakfast news, very important in America, not so important here in Austria. You switch between like CNN and Fox News, or MSNBC and Fox News, and you think these people are reporting from different planets, because sometimes there is nothing in common. But you have to know both sides, which is a challenge sometimes, But yes, we are Austrian Broadcasting Organization is a public broadcaster, so we have to, try and stay neutral, not neutral, I don't want to use that word, but objective as much as we can. I know there's always a little bias somewhere, but it was really not easy, and you just have to listen to all kinds of news to digest that. I think we should slowly come towards to an end. Let me talk about one thing that fascinated me when I was in America, and still fascinates me, how much my American friends talk about sports and their love of sports. I, of course, went to Notre Dame, which you may know is one big football university. So football weekends were fantastic, starting on a Thursday with a pep rally, on pre-parties, pre-game parties, tailgaters, after game parties, and went on until the next day. Fantastic. And everybody still, not friends from Notre Dame, they still watch every game. And then send me sometimes emails and text messages about what's happening there. You have a background as a sports reporter, and you've written a few papers about sports journalism. What's different about sports journalism than covering politics, even though there's a great deal of rivalry, emotional investment for consumers in both? What did you find?
Yeah, so I mean, I think practically when I was in professional practice, I think one of the things that fascinated me about sports is I didn't grow up in a huge sports loving family, but just the emotional investment that people have. I fell in love with sports, but I was never like a fan. So I have teams that I follow, but if they lose, I'm not upset all week. Whereas I feel like true fans, I was watching a Dallas Cowboys game with a good friend when I was living in Missouri, and the Cowboys made a really terrible set of plays. And my friend leaned forward and cracked his glass top table with both hands because he was so angry, which I understood because it was a really bad set of plays. But I also thought, you just broke your $300 table, which just seemed like a really strong statement to make. But seriously, I mean, I think that this is one of the things that sports can do in sort of a positive sense, is that people become invested in something that's a part of their community, right? And a part of their identity. And so one of the things we see often in research now about sports journalism is that it really can draw a community together in really important ways. It's a way of sort of humanizing individuals that sometimes are on the outskirts of society. When they're playing for our team, they're our representatives, right? They're representatives for our community. And so we see a lot of this sort of boundary breaking that occurs within sports. And I think it's absolutely fascinating. And so it's interesting because within journalism, and we haven't talked about this prior, Hannelore, but I'm sort of interested now to know if this happened in your experience in Austria too, is that as a sports reporter, we were the toy department. And so our work was sort of trivialized in the newsroom. And in retrospect, like, I think what we did was important, but does this happen in Austria too? Is there the toy department?
Yeah, a little bit. Even though I must say sports in Austria are important in a different way when it's about skiing and all that. So yes, we get very interested. Then all of a sudden we like our sports reporters, but yes, they're over there,
It's the people with all the toys. I think that there was also, there was the sense of getting to do what you love for a living, right? So if you love sports as I do, you get to go to these games. Normally people spend a ton of money to go, and you get to go for free. Of course, what's forgotten sometimes is the labor that goes with that. You're sitting in the cold stadium stands, very late on a Friday night when you could be enjoying the game and going to the tailgate with your friends, But in any case, I find sports and lifestyle journalism in general to be an absolutely fascinating aspect of journalism that is really a great way of sort of seeing some of the humanizing things that journalism can do to bring people together. And with that, why don't I go ahead and pass it to Mitch so we can take some questions.
Hello, Hannelore Veit, and also Greg. Thank you so much for being a part of this wonderful Alum Chat. Our audience has provided a few questions that I would like to pose to both of you. The first question is, can you both share some advice on how to report and speak publicly about conscientious and politically sensitive topics?
Politically sensitive topics. Well, in a way, coming from working for a public broadcaster, you try, if you're reporting, you try not to take sides. Not listen to, but give us the sense of how both sides feel. I think it is different when we talk about the current situation, Ukraine, what a whole world practically is on the same side against one country. So there it's very hard to be non-partial because the whole world is partial. But of course, you also have to report on what the other side says. I mean, I'm trying to answer that as best as I can. But you have to try and understand. That's what we are doing, basically. I was at a discussion on Ukraine yesterday. We all try to understand why is happening what is happening. So you have to listen to what they say. Whether you like it or not is a totally different subject. But we have to discuss it. We have to be transparent about it.
I agree completely. I mean, I think one of the things, I think my advice differs depending a little bit on what the topic is and how sensitive the topic is, of course. But I think obviously being as informed as you possibly can about the topic is essential. So interviewing widely, interviewing a wide range of perspectives, how you work those into your stories, can differ by publication and depend on the topic as well. But I think that's a starting place. One of the things I might add, and something that I've thought about quite a bit since I left daily journalism, is that we often think of ourselves in journalism as individuals, where there are certain topics where, again, if it's especially sensitive, you don't have to feel totally alone. If you're a part of a newsroom, there's people who can support you and give you feedback on things. And you should definitely, on certain topics, feel empowered to invite those people to, provide feedback on those. So certainly there's copy editing built into certain types of journalism. So some of that structure is built into certain newsrooms. But I would encourage journalists, depending on the topic, to invite other people to provide feedback on some of those sensitive topics in their newsroom.
Just one thought that I would like to add to that: there usually are guidelines for with every media outlet, like how far do you want to go? I know at ORF you do not show killings, even though it is part of the news, you just don't show it. Other stations that are less sensitive, they might, but we have, especially, when it's the main evening news, you try to protect the audience from too much brutality, in a way.
Thank you, Hannelore, and thank you, Greg. Another question from the audience: fake versus facts. What are the biggest pitfalls for quality investigation, and journalists' sharpest tools to find truthful representation of situations and events?
I just read 2 days ago, I think it was the Washington Post, how they verify their stories of what's going on in Ukraine. It's fascinating. Try to find that piece. It tells you a lot about data journalism, how you can, you get all kinds of pictures if you sit at the headquarters and you try to turn that to get a picture in your head to see what is really happening out there. You don't know. In every war, there is a lot of disinformation coming from both sides. So you have to verify. You have to see what is likely. Could that be? You have to compare pictures, maybe. You have to compare quotes from people to see if the picture is like really where they say it is from. And you can do that. It's not so difficult because every picture has a geolocation and a background, every video, every news picture. But more and more media, newspapers, TV stations and whatnot have their own departments to verify the story, to find facts, actually. What is a fact and what is fiction and what is fake news?
I'd like to read that article because that sounds fascinating. And I think particularly in a hot button situation like Ukraine, I mean, I would imagine that is, in terms of verifying things on the ground, that would be one of the highest watermarks for things that are both essential and very, very difficult, So I have two thoughts. First is that I think in terms of verification, I think that's normatively one of the requirements in the field and absolutely essential. And it's interesting, as a norm in journalism, one of the things that we're doing more and more of is, we see something on Twitter and then we report on what we saw on Twitter, which seems to duplicate because we could just go look at it on Twitter. And I think that there are certain topics where we find that there's certain news sites that still try to do that. I don't know if that's necessarily effective for providing the sort of verified, in-depth information we need. And so I think my second thought is we need to go quite a bit further than that. And so when we see these early reports coming out of certain situations on Twitter or whatever, I don't think it's thorough enough to just report on the tweet or the initial image. We need to dig quite a bit deeper. And so that means, yes, getting the official reports, but also trying to find people on the ground. And that does require quite a bit more legwork, quite a bit more labor, but that's the expectations of the field. And that's what makes what we do in journalism so essential.
Thank you. We have one more question. Greg, you mentioned Ukraine at the moment, and the last question is coming up with a current issue in Ukraine. Seeing what's happening in Russia and Ukraine at the moment, they would be interested in your insights about censorship and defamation of journalists, and whether you or Hannelore have experienced something like this yourselves.
So I haven't experienced much of this. I'd be curious to hear Hannellore's experience as a political journalist. I did face this once in sports journalism, and ironically, I mean, I guess it's not ironic. It was in covering a Little League World Series, and the parents did not like that I had interviewed a particular person for this story, and they went on a campaign that this reporting on the Little League World Series, I had just covered it really, really poorly. And thankfully, this was a case where the newsroom had my back and whatever, but that's very much sort of small scale compared to what so many journalists face in terms of, you know, harassment, hate mail, death notes. The stories that journalists have in facing this are sometimes quite harrowing. And I think what we sometimes mistake is that when we're defaming and harassing journalists, you know, we're cutting in on something that's one of our strongest defenses in democracy. And so it's actually quite a terrible sign to see these things happening to journalists worldwide, because it cuts in on what is our best line of defense.
Absolutely, I totally agree. Journalism is so important, but my own experience, not so much, but if you have been following my colleague, Carole Schneider, she is in Moscow now, and you know that journalists in Moscow are threatened with jail if they report the way we normally report. So she is struggling with that. She's doing a very good job, but I listened to her yesterday or on Sunday it was, I think, and all of a sudden she's just very much to the point, and you could feel how she weighs each word, not to go too far, not to say the wrong thing, because she's staying in Moscow and she wants to stay there, and she doesn't want to be jailed. At some point she was even saying, you know, I have to be very careful with what I say, because you are not supposed to mention the word war, etc., etc., etc. So that is very difficult, because she's really under threat there. Another example that I can think of is reporting on Trump campaigns. I have to say I never had any problems. I did reporting on some of his campaign speeches, but I know a cameraman who sometimes worked for us, a freelance cameraman, who said, I'm not going to another Trump rally because some of his supporters would turn against the press, and Trump encouraged them. Of course, he would always say, "Oh, look at the what did he call us? The I can't think of the word right now. The fake news." In any case, not the unlawful, but whatever, I'll think of the word in a second, fake news and whatnot, and always turn around and they won't report on what I'm saying, blah, 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 blah. And some of his supporters, you know, they almost got violent, and this cameraman, he was thrown to the ground with his camera, which is worth tens of thousands of dollars. And he said, I'm just not doing this anymore. So yes, it was happening, not to the same degree that it's happening now in Russia, but there were some journalists who did feel threatened in America during the last campaign. Not a very nice note to end this.
I have one more question. So the last question is about social media. And I think that's important, especially when talking about journalism today. With social media, how does it affect journalism? Do you use it to identify new stories?
I'll be curious to hear Hannelore's thoughts on this. My initial feeling, and I'll just speak from my perspective on this, is that I actually think social media has been quite debilitatory overall for journalism, in the sense that, number one, I think it's, they've used the word infodemic. You know, there's so much information on social media that it's sort of watered down the verified, important information that's absolutely essential coming from journalists. And it's also empowered these sort of like quasi pseudo journalists that, you know, have the trappings and act like journalists, but they're not practicing any of the verification practices that are essential to our field. I think that makes it more difficult for people to navigate when things are true or not. You know, I still get Facebook messages from friends from growing up. Oh, have you seen this news story? And it's a bunch of guys in a bar with a bunch of microphones, you know, that they're not actual journalists. And it's hard to explain, you know, that they might look like they're doing journalism, but those, you know, this is not actual journalism occurring here. I think that journalists have also felt the need to use it to reach their audience, because that's where the audiences are. And in some cases, as with what I sort of pointed out earlier, you know, social media can actually kind of muddy the waters in terms of trying to do the on-the-ground reporting that's so essential, because sometimes you can't verify things the moment they happen, right? It takes time to get the official reports to match it with what's happening there on the ground. And so I think that, you know, I think journalists are doing the absolute best that they can, given what the expectations are. In America, we obviously have a market orientation in journalism, so it's just expected. Journalists have to make use of social media to reach their audience, to hit certain, you know, metrics and things like that, and have done a remarkable job in doing so. That said, I think overall, thus far, it's been very debilitating to the field overall.
I'd say it goes both ways, because I can think of examples where social media really help highlight a problem, thinking of racist attitudes in the police. Why do we hear so much? Why have we heard so much about it in the past few years? Because there are people, there's video, there are people filming and posting it. So yes, it is always talk to Black people. It's always been there, but now we know about it. So that's the positive side. The negative side, of course, you have to know who you trust, and being on social media or getting your news from social media is usually a reinforcement of your own views. It reflects your own views, because this is the sources that you go to, people who, you know, sort of support what you say because you want to hear what they say. So you don't get all sides. You are missing the big picture sometimes. So I'd like to say what is very important: use social media, yes, but check your sources and know how to use them and know what you're doing.
Thank you very much to both of you. And I'd like to pass the baton now to Hermann for his final words.
Thank you. Thank you, Mitch. Thank you, Hannelore. Thank you, Greg, for your time and basically showcasing with your discussion what Fulbright is all about, bringing people together. From both continents, transatlantic communication, former student, former scholar, coming here together on this virtual platform to talk and to showcase the long-lasting impact of the Fulbright Awards. And this would not be possible without the support of the Boltzmann Institute of Austrian American Studies. So with this, I also would like to hand it over to Kevin for final words from your side. It's
our pleasure. It's the Institute's pleasure to support Fulbright Austria and people like Hannelore and Greg. And it's an honor for me to just be here. But thank you all.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Hannelore.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Turn in for the next Alum Chat. It's on our website, and I hope to see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.